Brenda laughed, a bright, clear sound, as she linked arms with a man whose face I didn't recognize, right there in the church parking lot after my mother's funeral. She looked at me, her smile faltering for just a second, before turning back to him, pulling him closer. "Some people just know how to live," she said, her voice carrying across the asphalt. "Don't they?" Paul Anderson, a 47-year-old from Kansas, reflected on his 20-year marriage to Brenda Olson. He recounted their seemingly loving early years, with him as CEO and Brenda as a housewife. Paul expressed his deep, constant desire for children, longing for laughter in their home. Brenda consistently avoided the subject, prioritizing her appearance and citing a "my body, my rules" philosophy. She told Paul, "I think everything should happen in its own time. I love my body and my looks, and I don't want to lose them." Despite his disturbance at her views, Paul remained patient, holding on to hope she would eventually change her mind. He strongly believed in mutual respect and individual autonomy, even with his traditional family values. 15 years into their marriage, Paul, now 42, noticed gray hairs appearing, a clear marker of passing time. Brenda became increasingly distant, consistently rejecting his touch and pushing away intimacy. Paul initially attributed her rejections to stress or other life pressures, trying to rationalize her behavior. However, her constant refusals made him begin to wonder if he was the actual problem. A growing fear of his own infertility started to take root in his mind. Paul Anderson often thought about the last 2 decades, particularly when the Kansas sun dipped low, painting the wheat fields outside his office window in shades of amber and rust. He was 47 now, a hale and hearty man by most accounts, overseeing a food company that had grown steadily under his hand. But the true measure of his life, he sometimes felt, lay not in balance sheets, but in the quiet, echoing rooms of his large, well-kept home. He'd been married to Brenda Olson for 20 years. 20 years. The number settled on his tongue, flat and unyielding. Their early years had held the promise of an open prairie. Brenda, a striking woman, had seemed content in her role as a housewife, maintaining their home with a precise, almost clinical order. Paul had worked hard, building his company, coming home each evening to her calm presence. There had been a tenderness, a routine of shared meals and quiet evenings. He had believed in those years that they were building something strong, something lasting. What he had always yearned for, a deep ache he rarely spoke aloud, was the sound of children. He imagined small, quick footsteps on the polished oak floors, the bright, unburdened laughter filling the space between the walls, a son to teach how to cast a line in the creek, a daughter to push on a swing beneath the old oak in the yard. He pictured hands, small and clumsy, reaching for his own. He wanted to see a legacy, a continuation, a family unit in its truest, most complete form. Brenda, however, had always sidestepped the subject. He'd bring it up cautiously, usually over dinner, letting the idea hang in the air like dust motes caught in the lamplight. She would change the subject, or offer a vague answer that left him feeling like he'd misread the map entirely. "Paul," she'd said once, early on, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass, "I think everything should happen in its own time." Her voice was soft, reasonable. "I love my body and my looks, and I don't want to lose them." She'd smiled then, a small, private smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. A smile that seemed to hold a secret he wasn't privy to. Paul had been disturbed by it. The casual dismissal of something so fundamental to him, the open acknowledgement of vanity. Yet, he held on to a quiet patience. He reasoned that she was still young, perhaps not ready. He believed in respecting individual choices, in giving space for personal desires, even if they clashed with his own deeply held, traditional beliefs about family and purpose. He told himself she would change her mind, that the maternal instinct would eventually surface, like a dormant seed finding its way to the sun. He waited. He hoped. 15 years bled into the landscape. Paul was 42 when he first noticed the gray hairs at his temples, silver threads woven into the dark brown. Lines had begun to etch themselves around his eyes. Faint reminders of years spent squinting at balance sheets, smiling at clients, and waiting for Brenda. The house remained meticulously clean, silent save for the hum of the refrigerator. The laughter he'd longed for never materialized. and with the passing of years, a new distance began to grow between them. Brenda started to pull away, subtly at first, then with increasing regularity. His hand reaching for hers on the sofa would be met with a slight shift. A sudden need to adjust a pillow. A tentative touch in bed would result in a murmured, "I'm tired, Paul," or a turn of her back, her shoulders rigid beneath the sheets. Intimacy, once a comforting rhythm, became a landscape of small, polite rejections. He tried to rationalize it. Stress from work. Perhaps. The daily grind. Her own quiet, internal battles he knew nothing about. He offered to help more around the house, suggested weekends away, anything to bridge the growing chasm. But the rejections kept coming, steady and consistent, like a slow drip filling a bucket. The warmth that had once existed between them cooled, hardening into something brittle and distant. He'd lie awake in the dark, listening to her quiet breathing beside him, the space between their bodies a vast, cold expanse. Slowly, a different fear began to take root in his mind, insidious and chilling. He started to wonder if he was the problem, if some unseen fault in him, some biological failing, was the reason for their empty home. The thought, once whispered, then shouted inside his head, was infertility. Paul, consumed by fear, secretly underwent extensive medical tests. He felt immense relief and joy upon learning he was perfectly healthy and fertile, even in his early 40s. A cold, stark realization dawned on him. The problem regarding children wasn't his, but Brenda's all along. Suspicion began to gnaw at Paul, prompting him to start discreetly observing Brenda, like a fox lurking in the shadows. One evening, he returned home to find Brenda absent, sparking an impulse to search their bedroom. He meticulously sifted through their belongings, approaching the task with the precision of a detective. Hidden in a forgotten box, he discovered a packet of birth control pills. A profound wave of disbelief and anger washed over him. Realizing Brenda had been deceiving him for 2 decades, he carefully replaced the pills, formulating a plan for confrontation, but other signs of betrayal quickly surfaced. Brenda became fiercely protective of her phone, keeping it locked and consistently out of Paul's reach. The fear had been a dull ache, a constant pressure beneath his ribs. It led Paul to make an appointment with a urologist a few towns over, a clinic where he was unlikely to run into anyone he knew. He'd gone alone, explaining his quiet concerns to a doctor who listened with a practiced, neutral expression. The tests were comprehensive, a series of visits spread over several weeks, blood work, samples, microscopic analyses. Each time he left the clinic, a fresh knot of anxiety would tighten in his stomach. He'd told Brenda he was working late, or on a rare business trip, inventing excuses that felt thin even to his own ears. Then came the call. The doctor's voice was calm, professional. "Mr. Anderson," he'd said, "all your results are back. Everything looks perfectly normal. You're in excellent health, and your fertility markers are strong, especially for a man in his early 40s. Paul had sat in his office chair, the phone pressed to his ear, the words echoing in the sudden silence of the room. A strange mix of relief and elation washed over him. He wasn't broken. He wasn't the problem. The knowledge settled in his chest, a warm, reassuring weight. He could have children. He was capable. But with that profound relief came a cold, sharp realization, one that cut through the lingering joy. If he was healthy, if he was fertile, then the reason their home remained childless wasn't him. It had been Brenda all along. The casual comments about preserving her looks, the evasions, the consistent unwillingness to discuss it. It all clicked into place, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. The truth was a hard, indigestible lump in his throat. Suspicion, once a fleeting shadow, now settled into his bones. It was a gnawing thing. Quiet, but relentless. Paul started to watch Brenda, not openly, but with a new, almost predatory awareness. He moved through their days like a fox in a discreet way, lurking in the shadows, noticing small gestures, inflections in her voice, deviations from her usual patterns. He observed how she spent her afternoons, the casual errands she ran, the way her eyes sometimes flickered away when he asked about her day. He found himself cataloging these observations, not out loud, but in the quiet chambers of his mind. One Tuesday evening, He pulled his car into the driveway a little earlier than usual. The house was dark. Brenda wasn't home. This wasn't entirely unusual. She had her book club or volunteer meetings. But a sudden, urgent impulse took hold of him. A new, unsettling resolve hardened his jaw. He let himself in, the familiar silence of the house amplified by his own quickened heartbeat. He went straight to their bedroom, the large, sparsely decorated room where they'd shared a bed for 2 decades. He started his search methodically, like a detective sifting through clues. He wasn't looking for a note or a diary, but for something tangible, something she might have hidden. He checked her dresser drawers, the back of the closet, the small decorative boxes on her vanity. He went through her handbag, not finding anything unusual, just her wallet, keys, and a compact mirror. He moved to the nightstands, then to a seldom-used storage box beneath the window seat, where old photo albums and seldom-worn scarves were kept. And there, tucked beneath a silk scarf at the very bottom, he found them. A small, flat cardboard dispenser, familiar even from a distance. Birth control pills. Not an old, expired packet, but a current one, neatly punched out to the present week. His breath hitched. The air in the room seemed to grow thin. 20 years. 20 years of his longing, his patience, his silent fears, all built on a lie she had carefully, meticulously maintained. The sheer audacity of it, the quiet, daily deception, hit him with a force that left him momentarily breathless. He stood there, the little box in his hand, a dull roar in his ears. Disbelief warred with a bitter, simmering anger. He carefully, almost surgically, returned the pills to their hiding spot, arranging the scarf over them exactly as he'd found it. He wanted to confront her, to throw the evidence in her face, but a colder, more calculating part of his mind took over. He needed to be sure. He needed more. The next morning, and in the days that followed, new signs of her betrayal began to emerge, almost as if the universe itself was now pulling back the curtain. Brenda became fiercely protective of her phone. It was always in her hand, always face down, always locked. If he walked into the room, she'd angle it away, her thumb quickly finding the keypad to put it to sleep. It never lay casually on the kitchen counter anymore, nor was it left charging unattended. It was a small, silent sentinel, guarding secrets Paul was now desperate to uncover. The bank manager requested a private meeting with Paul, appearing visibly uncomfortable. The manager then revealed that Brenda had been making frequent and substantial withdrawals from their joint account. Paul's heart sank upon hearing this news, though he initially tried to rationalize the withdrawals as expenses for spas or beauty treatments. He still held on to a lingering trust in Brenda, clinging to a false sense of normalcy and ignoring the accumulating red flags. As Paul drove home, still processing the troubling information from the bank, he witnessed a sight that turned his blood to ice. He saw Brenda exiting a fancy car, driven by a much younger man. The man, Chad Miller, appeared to be in his 20s, barely older than a boy, with a youthful, handsome look that sickened Paul. Paul watched, frozen in disbelief, as Brenda and Chad walked together into a nearby hotel. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The birth control pills, the secret bank withdrawals, and her distant affection. He realized it was an affair, confirming his deepest fears and suspicions. His wife of 20 years, Brenda Olson, had become a complete stranger, unfaithful and deceitful. Paul felt a cold, hard resolve settle within him. He would not allow this kid to destroy his life. The call from Frank Harrison, the bank manager, came on a Thursday morning. Frank's voice was usually hearty, full of small-town cheer. But this time it was strained, edged with an uncharacteristic formality. He asked Paul to come in for a private meeting, suggesting there was a matter he needed to discuss confidentially. Paul felt a flicker of unease, but pushed it down, assuming it was a routine business matter. When he arrived, Frank looked genuinely uncomfortable, his gaze shifting from Paul to the stack of papers on his desk. He cleared his throat. "Paul, I wouldn't normally get involved in personal matters, you know that, but as your banker and a friend, there's something you need to see." He then laid out a series of statements, highlighting recent transactions. Brenda had been making frequent, substantial withdrawals from their joint checking and savings accounts, not hundreds, but thousands, often in cash, sometimes multiple times in a week. Paul's heart sank, a slow, heavy descent. He took the statements, his eyes scanning the dates and figures. The numbers blurred, then sharpened. These weren't small amounts. He felt a desperate urge to rationalize it. Maybe it's for some new spa treatments, he offered, the words sounding hollow even to himself. Or a new wardrobe? Brenda does like to keep up appearances. He tried to cling to that explanation, to the image of Brenda as the careful, appearance-conscious wife. He still trusted her. Or at least, he desperately wanted to. He ignored the gnawing in his gut, the red flags that had been waving for weeks, choosing instead to believe in a normalcy that was rapidly disintegrating. He left the bank. The heavy folder of statements clutched in his hand, the setting sun a fiery orange in his rearview mirror. His mind replayed Frank's hesitant words. The numbers on the printouts. He was still trying to make sense of it, to fit it into the safe, predictable world he thought he shared with Brenda. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets and houses. But his perception was sharper, almost hyper-aware. Then he saw it. He was 2 blocks from their house, turning onto Elm Street, a quiet residential lane with mature trees. Parked discreetly a little ways down was a sleek, dark blue sports car, a model Paul recognized as expensive, flashy. And as he watched, frozen, the passenger door opened. Brenda stepped out. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before. A soft, flowing fabric that caught the late afternoon light. She looked radiant, her hair styled, a smile on her face that he hadn't seen directed at him in years. His blood ran cold. The driver's side door opened, and a man emerged. He was young, much younger, barely older than a boy, Paul thought, a bitter taste filling his mouth. 20-something perhaps, lean, with a shock of light brown hair that fell just so, and a confident, easy grin. Chad Miller. Paul had heard his name mentioned in passing at Brenda's book club, a new member, she'd said. He was handsome, in that youthful, unlined way that Paul suddenly found sickening. Paul pulled his own car to the curb, idling, half hidden by a large oak tree. He watched, unable to move, unable to breathe. Brenda and Chad stood by the car for a moment, talking, laughing softly. Then Chad reached out, his hand resting casually on the small of her back as they turned and walked together, not towards her car, which was parked further undefined. Soon after witnessing Brenda at the hotel, Paul received a call from her, noting the coldness in her voice. Brenda dropped a bombshell. "Paul, we need to talk. I've come to a decision. I don't love you anymore, and I want a divorce." Paul was stunned, struggling to breathe, and questioned her, pleading for understanding, recalling their wedding vows. Brenda's face remained stone cold as she stated, "It's simple. I don't love you anymore. It's over. I want to separate on good terms, divide up the assets." She added, chillingly, "I want to be free like a bird. I'm not going to ruin my body for you. I've always told you, my body, my rules." In that crushing moment, Paul realized their marriage was unsalvageable. Brenda was absolutely resolute. He felt his decades of love, commitment, and sacrifice slipping away, dissolving into nothingness. Enraged, Paul hurled the birth control pills in her face, declaring, "Then take your pills since you want to live like a unspoken, go ahead, don't worry about me anymore. I hope your young lover can give you the life you want." Brenda feigned shock and denial, retorting, "What are you talking about? What lover? Are you drunk or something?" Paul, seething with fury, unleashed his full anger. "I'm not drunk. I'm clear-headed. You've wasted 20 years of my life with your lies, your pills, and your affair. I saw you with him, that kid who could be your son. Walking into that hotel, I know about the money you've been taking out." Paul drove home. The image of Brenda and Chad walking into the hotel seared into his mind. He pulled into his garage, the darkness a welcome cloak. He didn't go inside immediately, instead sitting in the silence of his truck, the engine ticking as it cooled. The air in the cab felt thick, heavy with the weight of 20 years of unspoken truths and now, undeniable lies. He knew. Everything clicked into place. The pills, the secret withdrawals from the bank, the long-standing emotional distance, the rejection of his touch. It was an affair. His wife of 20 years, Brenda Olson, was no longer just his wife. She was a stranger, unfaithful and deceitful. A cold resolve settled deep within him. He wouldn't let this kid, this young man, Chad Miller, destroy his life. Not after everything he'd built. He finally went inside. Brenda wasn't there. He waited. The house felt like a tomb. When his phone finally buzzed, late into the evening, he saw her name on the caller ID. He answered, his voice tight. "Paul, we need to talk," Brenda said, her voice devoid of warmth, flat and distant, as if she were reading from a script. "I've come to a decision." He braced himself, though nothing could have prepared him for the words that followed. "I don't love you anymore," she continued, without a flicker of emotion. "And I want a divorce." The air left Paul's lungs in a rush. He gripped the phone, his knuckles white. "What?" he managed, the word barely a whisper. "Brenda, what are you talking about? 20 years, our vows. What happened?" He felt a desperate plea rising within him, a need to understand, to somehow rewind time to a point before this brutal unraveling. He heard her sigh, a sound of weary impatience. "It's simple, Paul. I don't love you anymore. It's over." Her voice was like polished stone, cold and unyielding. "I want to separate on good terms, divide up the assets, make this as easy as possible." Then she added, her voice dropping slightly, a chilling undercurrent that confirmed everything he'd suspected. "I want to be free like a bird. I'm not going to ruin my body for you. I've always told you my body, my rules." In that moment, Paul knew. There was no going back. The marriage was beyond salvaging. Brenda's resolve was absolute, a wall of ice he couldn't hope to break through. His love, his commitment, the quiet sacrifices he'd made, the children he'd longed for. It all felt like sand slipping through his fingers, dissolving into nothingness. The quiet life they had built, or what he thought they had built, was gone. A deep, visceral rage flared within him, hot and blinding. He walked to the bedroom, his steps heavy with fury. He found the small box beneath the silk scarf, pulled out the packet of birth control pills. He walked back into the living room, where Brenda was now sitting, her expression calm, almost serene, as if she'd just delivered good news. "Then take your pills," Paul snarled, his voice raw, shaking with suppressed violence, and he threw the small cardboard packet directly at her face. It hit her cheek with a soft thud, then fell to the carpet. "Since you want to live like a whore, go ahead. Don't worry about me anymore. I hope your young lover can give you the life you want." The last words were laced with venom. Brenda flinched, then her eyes widened, a look of carefully constructed shock spreading across her features. "What are you talking about?" "What lover?" she demanded, her voice rising in feigned indignation. "Are you drunk or something? You're being irrational." Paul's control snapped. "I'm not drunk," he seethed, stepping closer, his body rigid with fury. "I'm clear-headed. Crystal clear. You've wasted 20 years of my life with your lies, your pills, and your affair." He pointed a shaking finger at her. "I saw you with him. That Chad Miller, that kid who could be your son, walking into that hotel. Don't you dare deny it. And I know about the money you've been taking out, Brenda. Frank Harrison called me today." Brenda, her deception now fully exposed, abruptly shifted from denial to a furious rage, attempting to blame Paul. Paul adamantly refused to back down, stating he possessed undeniable evidence, which Brenda scoffed at, believing herself untouchable. The divorce proceedings officially began, immediately becoming ugly and highly contentious. Brenda, guided by her lawyer, demanded a significant portion of Paul's successful company, their shared house, and substantial alimony. She portrayed herself as the ultimate victim, a devoted wife who had suffered under Paul's controlling and overwhelming desire for children. Paul, however, was absolutely determined to fight, instructing his lawyer to leave no stone unturned in their defense. He meticulously started compiling his evidence, detailed bank statements chronicling Brenda's unauthorized withdrawals, and photographic proof of Brenda and Chad Miller. He secured his medical records, conclusively proving his fertility, and prepared to expose Brenda's prolonged deception regarding the birth control pills. Paul also initiated an investigation into Chad Miller, quickly discovering that he was unemployed and financially dependent on Brenda's money. His initial anger solidified into a cold, calculated desire for justice, extending beyond a mere divorce. He wanted Brenda to face the full, unsparing consequences of her actions. Brenda's carefully constructed facade crumbled. The feigned shock vanished, replaced by a sudden, ugly rage that distorted her features. "You've been spying on me?" she shrieked, her voice high and thin, her hands clenching into fists. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? Always wanting things your way, always with your plans for a family. You stifled me, Paul. 20 years of playing the devoted wife to your sterile dreams." Paul stared at her, unblinking. "Don't you dare try to turn this on me, Brenda. I have the evidence." "Everything," she scoffed, a brittle, dismissive sound. "Evidence? What evidence? You think some pictures and a few bank statements will prove anything? I've been a dutiful wife for 2 decades. You can't touch me." She believed herself untouchable, cloaked in an imagined innocence, a victim in her own narrative. The divorce proceedings began with a swiftness that mirrored the shattering of their marriage. It was ugly, contentious, exactly as Paul had anticipated. Her lawyer, a slick, expensive man from the city, wasted no time in making Brenda's demands clear. They wanted a significant portion of Paul's company, the company he'd built from the ground up, with years of sweat and sleepless nights. They wanted the house, the one he'd worked to pay off, and they demanded substantial alimony, enough to ensure Brenda could continue her comfortable life, even with her freedom. Brenda, coached by her lawyer, painted a carefully crafted picture of herself as the victim. She was a devoted wife, she claimed, who had suffered silently under Paul's controlling and obsessive desire for children. She described his unreasonable expectations, how he'd pressured her, making her feel inadequate. She twisted his longing for a family into a weapon against him, portraying him as a tyrant who had stifled her individuality and her dreams. But Paul was not about to let her rewrite their history. His anger, once a hot, wild fire, had cooled into a hard, unyielding resolve. This wasn't just about ending a marriage anymore. It was about justice. He instructed his lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah Jenkins, to leave no stone unturned. "I want everything on the table, Sarah," he told her, his voice steady. "Every lie, every betrayal. I want her to face the full consequences of what she's done." He started compiling his evidence with meticulous care, the same focus he applied to his business. He gathered the bank statements, dating back years, detailing every one of Brenda's suspicious withdrawals. He hired a private investigator, discreetly at first, who provided him with irrefutable photos. Brenda and Chad Miller, hand in hand, entering and exiting hotels, sharing intimate dinners. The sight of them together still twisted something inside him, but now it fueled his resolve, turning hurt into a cold determination. He secured his own medical records, a thick file proving unequivocally his fertility. He pulled out the birth control pills from their hiding spot, placing them in a sealed bag as evidence. He was ready to expose her deception, her 20-year lie about not wanting children, about my body, my rules. Words that now rang with a hollow, manipulative echo. He wanted the court to see the calculated cruelty behind her choices. The investigation into Chad Miller yielded even more disturbing information. Chad was unemployed, a drifter from a neighboring state who had landed in their town a year ago. He had no visible means of income, no assets. He was, as Paul had suspected, living entirely off Brenda's money, the money she'd been siphoning from their joint accounts. He was a parasitic figure, exploiting Brenda's newfound freedom and her desperation. Paul's initial fury at Brenda had now solidified into a cold, calculated desire for justice, far beyond a simple divorce. He wanted Brenda to face the full, unsparing consequences of her actions. He wanted the world, or at least the court, to see her for who she truly was. This wasn't just a battle for assets. It was a battle for his reputation, his dignity, and the truth. Life's costly choices often unfold in ways no one expects, leaving a trail of unexpected consequences. Stick around to the end to see how these choices play out. The divorce hearing commenced, filled with palpable tension, as Brenda, confident and poised, presented her version of events. She asserted that Paul was obsessively fixated on having children, neglected her emotional needs, and subjected her to emotional abuse. Paul's lawyer initiated the cross-examination, methodically and systematically dismantling Brenda's carefully constructed narrative. Evidence of the birth control pills was introduced into court, alongside Paul's conclusive fertility test results. Brenda's long-standing lies about wanting children in her own time were unequivocally exposed as a deliberate, two-decade deception. The courtroom reacted with visible shock and disbelief at this revelation, causing Brenda's composure to visibly crack. Paul's lawyer then presented the detailed bank records, meticulously detailing Brenda's extravagant and unexplained withdrawals. Brenda attempted to justify these transactions as legitimate personal expenses, but the sheer volume and suspicious timing raised significant doubt in the court. The lawyer then called a witness, a private investigator, to present irrefutable photographic evidence of Brenda and Chad Miller entering the hotel. The photos, starkly clear and undeniable, unequivocally confirmed the affair, leaving Brenda utterly humiliated in the courtroom. The courtroom on the day of the divorce hearing was small, typical of a county seat in rural Kansas. Paul sat beside Sarah Jenkins, his lawyer, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and grim resolve. Brenda sat across from them, next to her own attorney, looking impeccably dressed and composed. She had an almost serene confidence about her, as if she truly believed her version of events would prevail. The tension in the air was thick, a silent weight pressing down on everyone present. Brenda's testimony began, delivered with practiced ease. She spoke of their early years, painting a picture of Paul as a demanding husband, obsessed with the idea of children. She claimed he neglected her emotional needs, always prioritizing his work and his singular desire for a family. She described him as emotionally abusive, creating an environment where she felt stifled and unheard. Her voice was steady, calm, almost mournful, as she spun her narrative of a wife suffering under the weight of an overbearing spouse. Then came the cross-examination. Sarah Jenkins rose, her posture sharp and unyielding. She approached the stand, her gaze fixed on Brenda. "Mrs. Olson," Sarah began, her voice crisp. "You testified that Mr. Anderson's desire for children was a significant source of marital distress, correct?" "Yes," Brenda affirmed, a slight tremor in her voice. "It was constant pressure, and you repeatedly told Mr. Anderson that you wanted children. But in your own time?" "That's right. I believed everything should happen naturally." Sarah nodded slowly, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we would like to introduce Exhibit A and Exhibit B." Exhibit A was a sealed plastic bag containing the packet of birth control pills. Exhibit B was a copy of Paul's medical records, clearly stating his robust fertility. Sarah explained, in clear, concise language, how the pills were discovered and how Paul's tests confirmed his ability to have children. The impact was immediate. Brenda's composed facade began to crack. Her eyes darted from the pills to Paul, then to her lawyer, a flicker of panic in their depths. The court was visibly shocked. The judge, a stoic man named Judge Davies, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Brenda's 20-year deception, her carefully maintained lie about wanting children in her own time, was exposed as a deliberate, calculated falsehood. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, broken only by the rustle of papers. Sarah continued, pressing the advantage. "Mrs. Olson, for 2 decades, while telling your husband you desired children, you were actively preventing pregnancy, correct?" Brenda stammered. I needed to control my own body. That was my right, but you never communicated this decision directly to your husband, the man you claimed to love and intended to build a family with." Sarah's voice was devoid of judgment, merely stating facts, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Next, Sarah introduced the bank records, Exhibit C. She projected blow-ups of the statements onto a screen, highlighting the frequent, substantial withdrawals. "Mrs. Olson, Can you explain these transactions? Tens of thousands of dollars, often in cash, over the past year. Brenda attempted to explain them as personal expenses, shopping, gifts for friends, home decor. But the sheer volume, the consistency, and the lack of any corresponding purchases that could account for such sums, coupled with the timing of the withdrawals correlating with the timeline of her affair, raised immediate suspicion. Her explanations were flimsy, unconvincing, even to her own lawyer, who now looked increasingly uncomfortable. And these expenses, Sarah pressed, were they always for yourself? Mrs. Olson? Brenda hesitated, a bead of sweat forming on her temple. Mostly, yes, mostly, Sarah repeated, her voice rising slightly. Let's be precise. Were these funds ever spent on, or given to, anyone else? Before Brenda could answer, Sarah called her final witness. Your Honor, we call Mr. David Clark, a private investigator. Mr. Clark, a balding, serious-looking man, took the stand. Sarah then presented Exhibit D, a series of photographs projected onto the courtroom screen. The images were undeniable. Brenda and Chad Miller, hand in hand, laughing, entering a hotel. Another photo showed them leaving hours later, their faces close. The clarity was stark, the implications brutal. Brenda stared at the screen, her face draining of color, her mouth slightly agape. Her carefully constructed world, her veneer of injured innocence, had shattered. The affair, the financial deceit, the years of lying about children, all laid bare. Brenda was utterly humiliated, her composure completely gone, leaving only a raw, exposed vulnerability in its place. Brenda's lawyer attempted to salvage her crumbling case, arguing that the affair itself was irrelevant to the equitable division of marital assets. Paul's lawyer, however, expertly countered this, emphasizing that Brenda's fraudulent deception regarding children and her wasteful spending on her lover directly impacted marital assets and caused Paul profound emotional distress over 2 decades. He meticulously highlighted Brenda's fundamental lack of contribution to the marriage's stated goals, specifically building a family, her active sabotage of those goals, and her extensive financial drain on their shared resources. During the proceedings, Chad Miller was definitively revealed to be an unemployed kept man, living entirely off Brenda's ill-gotten gains. After careful deliberation, the judge delivered a stern and decisive ruling. He specifically noted Brenda's severe deception, her egregious misuse of marital funds, and the profound, long-lasting impact these actions had on Paul. The judge consequently awarded Paul a significant portion of the marital assets, considerably more than a typical 50-over-50 split, and emphatically denied Brenda any form of alimony. Brenda was left with minimal assets, her once pristine reputation utterly in tatters, and no financial support whatsoever from Paul. Chad Miller, her former lover, was conspicuously nowhere to be found. Paul experienced a bittersweet sense of vindication, feeling the immense weight of 20 years of Brenda's lies finally and completely lifted from his shoulders. Brenda's lawyer, a man whose expensive suit now seemed to hang a little less confidently, tried desperately to salvage what was left of her case. He argued that while regrettable, the affair itself was merely a personal failing, irrelevant to the equitable division of marital assets under Kansas law. He contended that Brenda, despite her actions, was still entitled to half of what they had accumulated over 2 decades of marriage. But Paul's lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, was unyielding. She rose, her voice calm but firm, addressing the judge directly. She argued that Brenda's deception regarding children was not a minor personal matter, but a profound, fraudulent misrepresentation that directly undermined the foundational purpose and expectations of their marriage for 20 years. Your Honor, Sarah stated, Mr. Anderson entered this marriage with a clear understanding and a shared goal: to build a family. Mrs. Olson actively and secretly sabotaged that goal while simultaneously allowing Mr. Anderson to believe it was a joint aspiration. Sarah then tied Brenda's actions directly to the marital assets. She meticulously detailed how Brenda's fraudulent deception regarding children had wasted 2 decades of Paul's life, preventing him from pursuing his dream of fatherhood with another partner. More than that, she emphasized how Brenda's wasteful spending on her lover, Chad Miller, clearly outlined by the bank statements and photographic evidence, constituted a direct financial drain on marital resources. These were not merely personal expenses, Your Honor. These were funds taken from the marital estate, funds Paul Anderson earned and squandered on an affair, not on the marriage or its shared goals. She highlighted Brenda's complete lack of contribution to the marriage's stated goals of a family, her active sabotage of Paul's deeply held desire, and the extensive financial burden she had become, supporting an unemployed man with Paul's money. It was revealed through further evidence presented by the private investigator that Chad Miller had indeed been a kept man, unemployed for the entirety of his relationship with Brenda, living entirely off the funds she'd siphoned from the joint account. Judge Davies listened, his expression grave, his eyes moving between Paul, Brenda, and their respective lawyers. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the evidence palpable. After a recess that felt like an eternity to Paul, the judge returned, his gaze settling on Brenda. His ruling was stern, delivered without equivocation. He noted Brenda's severe deception regarding the foundational issue of children, describing it as a profound breach of trust and a calculated misrepresentation. He condemned her misuse of marital funds, stating that the evidence clearly showed a pattern of reckless spending and financial support for an extramarital partner, directly at the expense of the marital estate. The profound emotional impact on Paul, the judge observed, was undeniable, stemming from years of living under a lie that denied him the most fundamental aspect of his personal dreams. Based on these findings, Judge Davies awarded Paul a significant portion of the marital assets, far more than the typical 50-50 split. He decreed that Paul would retain full ownership of his company, the house, and the majority of their savings and investments. Crucially, he denied Brenda any alimony, stating that her actions negated any claim to ongoing financial support from Paul. Brenda was left with minimal assets, essentially only her personal belongings, and a small portion of the less significant marital property. Her once pristine reputation in their small Kansas town was now in tatters, exposed not just as an adulterer, but as a calculating deceiver. She had no financial support from Paul, and Chad Miller, the young man for whom she had risked everything, was nowhere to be found, having apparently vanished as soon as the financial tap ran dry. Paul watched Brenda's face as the judgment was read, a complex mix of emotions churning within him. There was no joy, no triumph, only a bittersweet sense of vindication, the immense weight of 20 years of lies, of unspoken longing, of quiet betrayal, finally lifted from his shoulders. The truth had been revealed. Justice, in its own cold, unforgiving way, had been served. Brenda faced the stark consequences of her choices, her vanity becoming a heavy burden. She struggled financially, losing her social standing, and finding herself profoundly alone. Paul, though deeply wounded, slowly began to heal. Selling the old house as a symbolic release from the past, he continued to focus on his business and his own well-being, moving forward deliberately. He reflected on the harsh lessons learned about trust, deception, and the true meaning of partnership. Over time, Paul met someone new, a kind woman who genuinely shared his desire for a family. Together, they built a new life, a new home, free from the pervasive shadows of betrayal. Paul finally achieved his lifelong dream of fatherhood, holding his child and experiencing the profound joy he had yearned for. The story concludes with Paul, a man who had paid a steep price for another's infidelity, ultimately finding peace in the family he always desired. His journey demonstrated that honesty and integrity, even through deep pain, ultimately paved the way for a truer and more fulfilling future. In the aftermath, Brenda found herself adrift. Her vanity, once a shield she wielded with such precision, became a heavy burden. The carefully maintained looks began to show the strain of her new reality. Without Paul's support, she struggled financially, her small assets quickly dwindling. Her social standing evaporated, leaving her isolated in a town that now knew the truth of her deceit. She was alone, the freedom she'd craved proving to be a cold, isolating expanse. Paul, though deeply wounded, began the slow, deliberate process of healing. He sold the old house, shedding the physical embodiment of his past, a quiet act of liberation. He poured his energy into his business, its growth a testament to his resilience, and meticulously rebuilt his own well-being. He reflected on the harsh lessons learned about trust, the insidious nature of deception, and the true, unspoken meaning of partnership that he had once taken for granted. Years passed. Paul met Elena, a woman with a genuine warmth and a quiet strength. She worked as a librarian, her eyes bright with an uncomplicated kindness. They shared meals, talked late into the evenings, and discovered a mutual desire for a family. In a new home, filled with natural light, they built a life free from the shadows of betrayal. Paul finally achieved his dream of fatherhood, holding his infant daughter, her small hand clutching his finger. A pure, unadulterated joy spreading through him, a feeling he had yearned for and almost given up on. He had paid the price for another's infidelity, but through pain, through honesty, he had ultimately found his truer future. The Kansas sun, unyielding and bright, continues its daily arc across the sky, indifferent to the lives unfolding beneath it. Paul Anderson, now a father, watches his daughter chase fireflies in the soft evening light. A sight he once believed was impossible for him. The old house is gone, replaced by a new one, built on solid ground and honest intentions. He runs his company with the same unwavering focus, but with a deeper understanding of what truly matters. Brenda, stripped of her carefully curated world, fades into the background of the town, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. Her pursuit of youthful vanity and transient pleasure left her with neither. Paul learned that some deceptions, no matter how subtly woven into the fabric of daily life, eventually unravel, exposing the threads of selfishness beneath. His journey, marked by betrayal and pain, ultimately led him to a quiet, profound peace. He found that integrity, though costly, is the only currency that truly pays off in the end.